QSO Today, episode 500. Hiroki Kato, AH6CY. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank Andrea Contini, M6DKU, for her $100 annual sponsorship this week, and Joey Smith for his monthly $10 listener sponsorship. Your contributions to QSO Today keep it coming now, 500 episodes. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. This is a bittersweet moment for me, as with this episode of QSO Today, I have reached 500 episodes published of this oral history of ham radio. The sweet thing is that along the way, I have met the most interesting amateurs, heard their stories, helped them to tell them here on the podcast. I have made lots of new friends and have learned so much more about the hobby than I thought I ever would. The bitter truth, at least for today, is that my father, George Guth, passed away this morning at the age of 94 years. Today is May 3rd, 2024. I remember him with a blog post, link in the show notes. So here we are, it's episode 500. No party or panel discussion, just another great interview. Here we go, into the future. Hiroki Kato, AH6CY, was born and raised in Hiroshima, Japan, 20 miles from the epicenter of the atomic bomb blast in August 1945 that killed approximately 100,000 Japanese. Hiroki was fascinated with radio as a youngster and was first licensed in Japan. After moving to the USA, Hiroki continued to pursue amateur radio and began to research and collect military radios that both the Japanese used to bomb Pearl Harbor and the radios that were on the Enola Gay, the U.S. bomber that dropped the Hiroshima bomb. AH6CY tells his ham radio story and about these radio restorations in this QSO Today. AH6CY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Hiroki?
Hello, Eric. This is AH6CY. Nice to see you.
Hiroki, thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
I was born in Hiroshima, Japan, about 20 miles outside of the city of Hiroshima. It was a kind of small village, and although today it is part of the city of Hiroshima. When I was a fourth grader, mind you, I was born 3 years before the end of World War II, and so I grew up in the post-World War II era, and everything was in disarray, and everybody was poor. The only item that is anything to do with electricity or electronics in our house was a broken radio. When I was a fourth grader, 9 years old, my father gave me this broken radio. I took it apart and put it back. Lo and behold, it worked. And I was hooked. And so I started tinkering around with the radios. These were, of course, tube radios.
Hiroki, did you have tools?
Well, the only tools I had was actually screwdriver and a little wrench, and I didn't even have a soldering iron then. But that was soon was the first item I acquired, and I had to beg my father to buy one. It was an expensive item in our economic status then. But anyway, as I said, the radio worked. And so that I was hooked. And so I started building my own radio, and I built a lot of shortwave radios. And when I was 15, I decided to try for the ham radio license. And the ham radio was opened after World War II. A few years before I actually applied for the license. So I built my first homebrew radio, which is a 5-watt 6v6 valve or tube radio. Unbeknownst to me at that time, this was 1957. This was at the peak of the cycle 19 sunspot cycle. I had no idea, but with my misery 5 watts, I could reach all over Japan practically every day, any time of the day. The condition was that good. And my interest in ham radio further increased. So I was quite active in operating my own homebrew radios. I built a number of them. And so I was quite active throughout the high school.
So when you built that 5-watt 6v6 transmitter, what did you use for the receiver? The same receiver that you had fixed before?
No, I had the 5-tube super heterodyne, again, homebrew variety.
Similar to the commercial AM radios that were popular in those days.
Yes, indeed. I secured the two 10-meter, 30 feet tall bamboo from a nearby forest, and that was my first dipole antenna.
You were 15 years old when you got your first license in Japan. What was your first call sign, and how did the licensing work there? Did they have like the novice license and the higher grades, or did they just have one grade of license?
There were 4 classes of license in Japan, and the entry level was the called the phone class and the CW class. And I had a phone class, so my first radio was actually AM transmitter, not CW. And the CW was not required for this phone class. And my first call sign was JA4 AAO, Juliet Alpha 4, the Alpha Alpha Hotel. I mean, Ontario. We used to call it Ontario, but I guess now it's Oscar. JA4 AAO was my first call.
And that was a phone class license.
Right.
What were the privileges? Just the 10-meter band, or was there other privileges that went along with it?
You can operate on 80, 15, and 10, all AM.
Was there a power limitation?
10 watts.
So Cycle 19 must have been really great. I've interviewed people that were there during Cycle 19. They said you could load up a wet noodle and talk around the world.
Yes, indeed. It was a very, very forgiving time.
Now, it's my understanding that there's almost 2 million Japanese hams now in a relatively small population compared to the United States. Why do you think that Japan took to ham radio? Because it sounds to me like they took to ham radio organically about the same time that you got into ham radio.
There were a number of reasons why there are more Japanese hams than in American hams. One of the most immediate factor that makes people want to do the ham radio was ease of entry. Imagine this: you can start talking on the phone, AM phone, from the very beginning. That was a big enticement for me and for many others. And even though there was a entry-level CW class, very few people took it because, as you know, it takes time to learn Morse code, whereas AM, you can just start getting on the air right away. And that was one of the reasons. And also, there has been, second factor I can think of is there has always been the arts and craft tradition in the Japanese culture. And the people are quite used to building little things. I built all of my toys essentially when I was like 5, 6 years old, using whatever is available around me. Every little kid carried a little pocket knife. If you combine the use of chopsticks, if you have a little knife to cut all kinds of things, and these were the times when, for example, you know, sharpening the pencil means you actually use a knife to sharpen the pencil. I don't think the American kids have ever used, actually, at least in the past 100 years or so, using a knife to sharpen the pencil. It's an electric sharpener, or the kind you use by just sticking it in and twisting it. But it was a standard, very common thing for us kids to sharpen the pencil with a knife. Now, these all contribute to the use of hands to build things. And so that was a second reason. And the third reason is that there is a government actually encouraged anybody, especially young kids, to get into amateur radio. In fact, even today, if you have the 10,000 QSOs you have conducted, you can approve that, then government issue you an award. I don't know of any other governments in the world which actively encourage the young people to get into ham radio.
I'm assuming access to telephones was probably not easy.
Absolutely. Probably I must have been about 12, 13 years old. This was like 10 years after the war was over that we got our first telephone. And majority of my neighbors didn't have a phone. So the telephone was not ubiquitous presence. So that's another probably factor too.
They used to tell a joke here in Israel. I was here in 1981 as a student. If you wanted a telephone, you had to order it, and you had to wait a long time. So the joke was, you order the telephone, and you say, well, when will it be delivered? And the telephone operator says, well, today is December 14th, 1980. I think we can deliver it on February 3rd, 1982. He says, I think I'm busy that day. And she says, you're busy on February 14th, 1982? He says, yeah, the air conditioning guy is coming that day.
I see.
So ham radio was very popular here until the rise of smartphones and cellular phones. But it sounds to me like the Japanese are still encouraging kids to come into ham radio. Maybe that's one of the things that the West needs to do in terms of getting more ham radio operators. It certainly benefits the society.
Right. And the fact that there are many ham radio operators, whether they stay active or not, but they just dip their feet into electronics that way, I'm sure have contributed tremendously to the development of electronics industry in Japan. Today, of course, we see products coming all over the Asian countries, Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, India, etc. The fact that the Japanese pick up the the industrial development early on after the World War II ended, I think owes at least partially to the presence of many ham radio operators who naturally continued their interest in the electronics industry. So,
well, transistor radios in the 60s, Japanese transistor radios were ubiquitous in America.
Absolutely.
Every beach towel in California had a Japanese transistor radio on it, as I recall.
Right.
So what happened after that, Hiroki? You get this amateur radio license at 15. Did amateur radio cause you to choose a technical direction for your career and education?
Well, I thought I was headed for the technical field or some science field in college and as a profession. Unfortunately, in my academic career, I couldn't get along with my chemistry teacher in high school, and the feeling was mutual. And if you don't do well in chemistry, you cannot get into the college major related to technology or electronics or anything like that. So I ended up going to the social science. I majored in political science in college. So ham radio stayed as an avocation. I have always kept the interest in the ham radio and the electronics in general throughout my life, my career, which didn't turn out to be in the electronics field. So after high school, I went to a college majoring political science in Tokyo. And then after my undergraduate education in Japan, I came to the U.S. to do graduate work. History and political science was my main interest area. I was going to go back to Japan after obtaining graduate degrees. Well, I met my future wife, and the rest is history. I didn't go back to live in Japan, although I have been to Japan many, many times, been back to Japan many, many times. At one time, I took a group of college students, my students, to Japan for half a year stay. Now, while I was working, I was a college student and started in the graduate work and started teaching in American universities. I kept interest in ham radio. I kept my license alive, both in Japan and in the U.S. But I was not active on the air. I was just too busy in my work. So even though I always had the operating ham station, even though I was not on the air much. But my rejuvenated ham activity started when I retired in the year 2000. Then I became really active in all manners of ham radio activities.
And where are you now? Where's the QTH?
I am in California, near San Francisco, right in the heart of Silicon Valley.
That's like Palo Alto, Menlo Park?
In a town called Portola Valley, next to Palo Alto. And every Friday afternoon these days, I get together with my QRP buddies and operate in a public park in Palo Alto, right on the San Francisco Bay. And QRP is one of the several major areas of ham activities I enjoy very much. Now, getting back to my sort of brief biography, I taught in American universities, several universities, for 20 years after I finished graduate school. But then I actually got into the electronic industry, mostly in marketing and sales capacity. And so I traveled to all the Asian and the Pacific Rim countries, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Singapore, India, Australia, Indonesia, etc.
Selling American products.
Selling American products.
If you were in California, you were there as the Silicon Valley is rising.
Yes, I didn't know at the time. I arrived in Silicon Valley just as the so-called Silicon Valley Revolution was starting. And there were still, unbelievably, the orchards, the apple orchards, some agricultural land in what is today Silicon Valley at that time. It was very fast. It was changing very fast into the electronic industry location.
Fairchild and Hewlett-Packard and Stanford University were the mainstays of the Valley in those days.
Yes. Yeah, the Silicon Valley actually had a very good environment where what has become known as Silicon Valley, it wasn't known as such then. But combination of the major academic universities such as Stanford University, University of California, Berkeley, and then it was a financial center. It still is. San Francisco is a financial center. And then the availability of labor force and the land and water. These factors are very important major factors to start electronic industry was here. So it was not really an accident. It was no accident that Silicon Valley has become a Silicon Valley.
The confluence of all of these resources made it ideal for what it eventually became.
Yes.
I remember as a kid, the Silicon Valley was orchards. I have a good friend that grew up in San Jose and remembers it being a hick town.
Uh-huh.
And it's far from that now. So when you were traveling around the Far East, what company were you representing and what were you selling?
Well, I have been involved in a number of startups and non-startups. As you may know, in Silicon Valley, at least in the early phase of Silicon Valley history, perhaps 1 out of 10 companies that start failed. And that was expected. And we hear all kinds of glorious success stories of a giant companies such as Google or Intel or Apple and such. But underneath that, the glorious successful companies, there are thousands of failed companies. So I worked for both successful and not so successful companies. It was an exciting time. One of the successful companies I worked for was iOmega. And the iOmega may not be known to a young generation today, but it was unbelievably, it had the actually faster rising stock price than Apple when it was going high. iOmega was the inventor of zip drive. And zip drive was the first in the world to produce the affordable, removable storage device. 100 megabytes, essentially about the same size as the floppy drive.
I remember, I think I had an iOmega zip drive.
So we sold millions and, well, I guess probably billions of these items. And so my role was to take the iOmega products into Asia and also locating the manufacturing places in places like Philippines and Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, and Japan.
Israel has the same history. You know, we've got our giants that have risen out of our Silicon Valley, but you're right, for every 20 companies, there was one rising star and all the rest failed.
Yes, I'm somewhat familiar with the Israeli scene. I have been to Israel many times. My wife's relatives, quite a few of them live in Israel, and some of them are working in the high-tech industry in Israel and also in Silicon Valley.
So we learned to fail fast here.
Yes.
But you know what? What's so interesting about that is without those failures, you don't have all these brilliant people in both valleys that actually create these amazing companies.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about business failure that makes you a better businessman.
Yes. As a matter of fact, when we were recruiting and at the various companies, we always look for people who have failed and succeeded. People who only knew success would not be a great candidate for us.
Because they knew how to pick themselves up and start all over again.
Right. It was a really risk-taking, high risk-taking environment. And if you are the type of people who shy away from risk-taking, you are not wanted here.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. Okay, so you retired in 2000. You've always had your license, but you came back with some new passions. What were those new passions?
Well, of course, like most hams, my earlier interest was the DX, just reaching the far reaches of the world, especially with the less and less power rather than more and more power became my interest. And also, because of my background, earlier on, I became interested in finding out what kind of communication device the wartime. Let me back up a little bit. I was 3.5 years old when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Living 20 miles from the ground zero meant that our life, my parents, my family's life, and as well as that of my neighbors and friends were all heavily influenced by what the bomb wrought. In a devastated, city and trying to rebuild the economy and so forth. The war was a daily reminder, even though war itself was over. The consciousness related to war just wouldn't have gone away. One of the such things for me, especially after I became a little interested in radio, as I mentioned earlier, when I was in 4th grade, was I wondered what kind of radios the airplane B-29 bomber called Enola Gay, which dropped the bomb, carried. And so that was a part of my consciousness. And also I was interested in what kind of radio they used in starting the Pacific phase of World War II, that is bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor occurred on in December 1941. I was born in January, that is a month after Pearl Harbor was attacked. So I was interested, I was curious, and although I didn't do anything about it, I couldn't do anything much about it then. What kind of radio they used, and that was been in the back of my mind throughout. And so when I retired, I became serious about researching these radios, and so that led to my general interest in looking at all the radios used in World War II, both in the European and the Pacific theaters. And to make a long story short, after learning what kind of radios the B-29 bomber Enola Gay carried, and also the three-seat bomber that dropped the bomb on Pearl Harbor carried, I started looking for actual model, the same model radios. And it turned out that acquiring the wartime radio used by American military establishment was relatively easy. Surplus market was quite open and active.
What did the Americans carry?
Well, this Enola Gay carried two major transmitter and auxiliary transceivers. The ART-13, which is a 100-watt AM and CW, and the MCW, that modulated CW transmitter. Enola Gay carried two ART-13. One was used to communicate up to 1,500 miles. That is to be able to communicate from the skies of Japan to the South Pacific islands where the American air base were located, specifically Tinian. Tinian was the air base, a little island where this air base was located and where B-29 took off for the Japan mission. So ART-13 could transmit efficiently at this distance. They carried the what is called ARC-5, smaller transmitter and receiver combination, which they used for air-to-air and then air-to the ground operating tower communication, in the short distance communication. And the Enola Gay, as I said, carried two ART-13. One is for communication between the aircraft and the Tinian Air Base, but another one, an ART-13, was to transmit the modulated CW tone, and it was switched on as the last bombing run started, and 45 seconds before the bomb was actually dropped. When the signal stopped, that's an indication bomb was released. So all the other B-29s were equipped with only one ART-13, but the Enola Gay itself has two.
And then what were the Japanese using when they bombed Pearl Harbor?
Japanese, the three-seater bomber, which was the command aircraft, and it took off along with many other bombers from the aircraft carrier from the near Midway area for the Pearl Harbor attack. And this was, as many of you know, many of the listeners would know, that it was not detected. There was some radar sighting which was misinterpreted as some kind of training mission. But anyway, hundreds of aircraft that took off from the aircraft carrier near the Midway. This was a few hundred miles the northwest of Hawaii. They arrived in the skies of Hawaii unmolested by American defenders, and everybody knows that it successfully made an attack on Pearl Harbor, decimating the American fleet in the Pearl Harbor. Now, the command aircraft was a 3-seater bomber, and it carried the transmitter called Ku Type 96, and it has also 100 watts output, but it is only CW only transmitter. And so many people have the impression that when the successful attack was conducted, they sent a message, Tora, Tora, Tora.
They made a movie.
Yes, there are many movies and many books are written, but nobody shouted Tora, Tora, Tora into a microphone. It didn't have a microphone. It's a CW only transmitter. And so the Tora, Tora, Tora was actually sent in Japanese Morse code and to the waiting aircraft carrier near Midway.
Now, you said that the American, like the ARC-5s and the ARC-13s, that these were actually relatively plentiful in the surplus market. How was it to find a Ku-96 or something similar from the Japanese?
Well, it was very difficult to locate the radios used by the Japanese military establishment, because when the General MacArthur came to Japan and as a supreme commander of the occupying Allied forces, he ordered complete destruction of wartime material, not just the tanks and the weapons, but also all the communication devices used by the Japanese military. So this explains why it is very rare to see the surviving the wartime radios. But interesting thing happened to me. I advertised in the electric radio, which some of you may know, some of the listeners may know, is a tube radio specialty magazine. But anyway, I advertised that I'm looking for the Japanese military radios, and I didn't have much hope for it. But one day, I got a call from someone who lived about 100 miles from me, saying that I think I have a Japanese military radio, and I don't know what it is, but come and take a look. So I went there, and they turned out to be exactly the same model as the one used in Pearl Harbor attack. It was a total serendipity, and so some of the surviving Japanese military radios of the World War II era were actually the radios brought back by American GIs stationed in the South Pacific Islands as a souvenir. And this is the reason why a few rare Japanese military radios are found in the U.S. The other military radio that survived were the ones used right after the war to augment the landline telephone communication. And these were exceptional radios that were allowed by the MacArthur's occupation regime.
And what was the condition of this radio when you found it?
Mine was surprisingly in good shape. All the tubes were there intact. The only thing missing was the power supply. So I had to build my own power supply to resurrect this radio.
Did you have to rebuild this radio in order to make it look new?
Very little. I cleaned it up, and then I had to build my own power supply to work with this. That's the only thing I did. So the radio itself was miraculously intact. I wouldn't say the same thing with my ART-13, the transmitter that was on the P-29. I had to do a lot of work on that one. But fortunately, the parts were pretty readily available in the internet. The internet market has done something great about great in terms of looking for all parts and all radios. Even today, on the eBay and other internet market, you do come across the military radios from World War II era, both the Japanese and Germans. Not very often, but if you keep looking, some of these old radios do show up.
The tubes that were used in radio sets before World War II in America, were they similar to the ones being used in Japan?
Yes.
So are they interchangeable?
Well, some were and some were not. Many of the Japanese tubes were copies of American tubes. The Japanese manufacturers were actually copying many American tubes before World War II began. After World War II began, the Japanese built their own tubes along with the copies of American tubes. So some tubes are interchangeable, others are not. This tube used in the Pearl Harbor attack, it was made in Japan tube, and it was not manufactured in the U.S. at all. Japanese tubes were the so-called ST and also the octal pin tubes, but there were no miniature tubes or sub-miniature tubes.
While MacArthur might have destroyed the military radios, the tube manufacturers were still there. And can you find tubes that are compatible with that radio now in Japan?
No, they are very, very difficult, almost impossible to find.
So this radio, does it get on the air?
Yes, it got on the air, just for testing purpose.
It's not a rig that you'll pull out every once in a while just to make a contact?
No.
Now, it's my understanding, because I've seen articles online and stuff, that you also are very interested in the spy radios that the Allied forces used in Europe during World War II. I think they call that the Paraset.
Yes.
We've had other Paraset restorers and builders on the QSO Today podcast. How did you become interested in the Paraset then? Did you refocus your interest and energies to the other continent?
Well, as part of my research into wartime radios, I did do a lot of readings and how radios were used. And one of the interesting books I came across in as part of my overall historical research was the book called Spy Princess. Spy Princess is the story of a young woman who worked as a radio operator agent for SOE. SOE stands for Special Operations Executives, which is a secret paramilitary organization created by Churchill a year after the European theater of World War II began. And after I read that book, Spy Princess, which is, as I said, is a young woman who worked as an agent, she was captured by Nazis in Paris and was later sent to a concentration camp and was executed. But she carried this one of the spy radios. There are several well-known spy radios used by SOE and MI6, the British intelligence agency, during World War II, and she carried a spy radio called B2. But I also learned after I started digging more into SOE activities, SOE used the simpler, lighter, the spy radio called Paraset, which became a sort of a cult radio among the to replicate Paraset, which is because the 3-tube relatively simple radio, and it has become a kind of a popular thing to do among some hams. Now I have built 3 of those, and one thing led to another, and so I have actually real model of B2 in my shack, which I restored, and actually that one I put on the air. It works very well, and Paraset, as I said, I built 3 replicas. Paraset is another radio impossible to find, almost impossible to find in the market. I have seen the real one in several museums in Britain and in the European continent. I became especially interested in Paraset partially because of the simplicity, but also it used as a final tube 6V6, the same tube I used in my first homebrew radio when I was 15. So I have a special feeling for this tube, 6V6, 5-watt tube.
So do you operate the Paraset when you go out on Fridays to do POTA?
Occasionally, not very often. Occasionally I do that, and I have done that, and I have some interesting QSOs with the Paraset. I also have 2 Cold War era spy radios, American spy radios, and one used during the Vietnam War era, especially in the jungle environment. It's a very interesting case. I can show you one of those.
So we're on a video conference right now, and Hiroki is in his garage showing me his stuff.
I am in my shack, and this is one of the 3 units. And as you can see, it is completely sealed.
It actually looks like a speaker.
It looks like a speaker, but
if you unscrew the case with the thumb screws,
this particular spy radio can be dropped from the aircraft, and it has to withstand the enormous
stresses of hitting the ground at terminal velocity.
Okay, yes, but it's completely steel. This is one of the 3 units: transmitter, receiver, and power supply come in different boxes. Now, around here, this is a gasket, and the cover I just took off is attached very tightly. This is totally impervious to water or anything that comes from outside. This was occasionally buried in the mud in Vietnam. So some American military unit or the intelligence unit who had to leave stuff for a few weeks and come back to retrieve it, they buried it in the mud. So I have never seen any other spy radios built in this way. But that's one of the...
So you have the transmitter and the receiver and the power supply? So you have a complete set?
Yes, this is a complete set. When I acquired it, I only had to do a minimal work to make it work. This has been...
Were those like AM and CW?
No, just CW. By the way, one of the common things in all of the spy radios during World War II and Cold War era was no spy radio had a speaker.
Well, it makes sense.
only headphones. Also, with a few exceptions, all of the spy radios has a key built in. The most key. Let's see. You may not be able to see this very well. This is a key.
Yeah, it looks like a little button on the bottom.
And the Paraset and the other spy radios also have the key built in.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. I saw there's a list of Paraset builders.
Yes.
And you're on the list. There's an organization, a society of...
There was a very active society located in Britain, and I was a member, and so are some of the hams in European continent, and the F6. Oops, I can't remember his call sign. Jean-Paul Moffet in southern France, and I have been the sort of a volunteer clearinghouse of all the Paraset radios, built and original, and they also built one. So we have been collecting the names of the museums and the hams and non-hams who have built the replicas. And unfortunately, that British-based Paraset organization is not functioning because majority of the members are silent keys. But there's a new Paraset group on the an interest group based in America, in the USA, and that is still going active. But the members are relatively new. Many of the people are in 60s and 70s, but unlike the other one I mentioned, headquartered and based in Britain, the members are relatively new, younger.
You were saying that you also restore other rigs, and I'm looking over your shoulder, and you've got a Collins S line with the amplifier and everything?
Right.
So you've rebuilt the Collins S line?
Yes. I acquired this S line and some time ago, a few years ago, and the major rework I had to do is naturally I do the old recap, change the capacitors, but all the components were in good shape, and I had to rebuild the power supply of the 30L1, the amplifier, 500 amplifier, and had to do some work in the transmitter, but not a whole lot of work was needed.
What's the rig to the left of the amplifier?
This one here, that's actually my main radio I use, the main HF radio, ICOM 7610. It's a very, very good radio.
Yes, I understand it is.
I have a whole bunch of homebrew QRP radios. Actually, it's all over my shack.
I'll make a reference in the show notes page to an article that you wrote about a potato QRP radio that apparently if you have 8 potatoes, you can actually run the radio. Could you talk a little bit about how that battery works?
Well, I had an article in April 2022, QST, about the potato radio experiment I did. It started out in a funny way that one day in my QRP group, Friday outing group, we were talking about the batteries. And one of the guys said, "Oh, I have a potato battery," which was a joke. And of course, I've never seen the potato battery used for ham radio, but it occurred to me, well, many people have the experience of playing the potatoes or bananas as a battery when they were in the grammar school. It occurred to me, maybe there's something interesting about the vegetable batteries. So I started doing some research, and I came across a very interesting article written by a professor at the Hebrew University, and he and his team discovered that when you boil potatoes, your battery output goes upward of 10 times output. So that really made me think, well, if you can, get the much higher current, maybe there's a way to use it for ham radio, for QRPP, that is 1 milliwatt class of transmitter and the receiver. So I got serious, and the potato, by the way, potatoes, and as well as bananas and the avocado and all the other vegetables and fruits I have tested usually produce 0.5 to a little over 1 volt. Some potatoes have now, but the current is minuscule, micro ampere. And but by boiling the potato, and I actually use the mashed potatoes and boiled potatoes and so forth, you can actually, from each large potatoes, russet potatoes, you can get about 5 milliamp 1 volt. Okay, so you can imagine if you can get 5 milliamp 1 volt, if you have 5 or 6 potatoes, now you are talking, you can actually power the QRPP radio. And so I looked for the transistors that can work in the low voltage. So here's one of the QRPP transceiver I built.
You're holding up your QRPP transceiver. Now, I saw that you made that with a Pixie.
Yeah, and inside is a Pixie transceiver, was originally developed in the 1990s by Northern California QRP Club. And it has the 3 transistors. And now today, this so-called Pixie radio was manufactured by a number of people in China, and you can buy them for anywhere from the US dollars, $3-4 to $15. Now, Pixie uses so-called the 386 audio amp, which doesn't work over unless you put in 9 to 12 volt. Now, the potatoes, even, of course, theoretically you can use 9 volt, 12 volt, but this audio amp consumes so much current, so much that is by a QRPP standard, that I replaced the audio amp with the different transistor, which requires much less current, lower voltage. So it is a modified Pixie radio is inside. I took off whatever is not needed, such as piezo sounder to make the CW side tone. I took it out so this QRPP radio can produce about the 3 milliwatts output.
Have you worked anybody with it?
Yes, with my QRP club members, I have done the experiment. I can reliably communicate up to 3 miles.
With the potatoes in series?
With a very simple vertical antenna. So if you use the big 4 elements Yagi with this, and especially in a good condition like today, probably you can reach. I wouldn't be surprised a few hundred miles.
What electrodes do you use in the potato?
Zinc and copper plates.
Strategically put into the boiled potato. And then when you're all done, you pull the plates out and you mash them up and you have...
Yes, I mash up and put it in a nice plastic box. So you can, come up with all kinds of original ideas how to store potato batteries. So,
how much operating time does that give you?
Unbelievable. I don't know. The reason why I don't know is that I didn't use it long enough as an experiment. But the potato batteries last a long time, and even though boiled potatoes start deteriorating, getting rotten. Even after they get rotten, they produce the electricity. So in one of the experiments I did with the potatoes, after 1 month after I boiled them, they were still going.
Oh, amazing. And I just bought a 7,000-watt generator for the war here, and I could have just bought a whole bucket full of potatoes for my emergency radio system.
Right. And as I said, it's not just potatoes. Any fruit.
Tomatoes, bananas.
Yeah.
Oranges have a lot of acid in them.
Yes, and also I haven't quite, there's endless experiment one can run. You can add some chemicals.
Then you couldn't eat them at the end or feed them to the goats.
Right. Well, I am banned from my kitchen by my wife now because I was banned from boiling many potatoes in the kitchen because I was making a big mess. But anyway, it was a fun project, and I hope people will continue to experiment because there's I think practical application in some of the developing areas. In some poor villages in Africa where there still is no electricity, and you need to communicate from one a village to another. I mean, it is not totally out of question to have the transmitter and transceiver powered by fruit and vegetables.
Maybe even a paraset. It would have to be a QRP transistorized paraset. You might have the idea for a new spy radio.
Yeah.
Do you think, Hiroki, that projects like this might interest younger people in developing perhaps an interest in these crafts? If we're trying to extend the culture of building and, I don't know, I tell my grandson, my father used to tell me, you're not dressed unless you have a knife in your pocket. So I've always carried a pocket knife in my pocket. It must be from his generation. I say this to my grandson as well, although it seems to me that he also has to learn how to use it. But do you think that this interest in the parasets and the potato radios, do you think that we can ignite some imagination in younger people to become interested in ham radio from this?
Well, I think we can. However, it is a little more complicated today because there are so many things that can distract young people from this sort of activities, video games, all kinds of TV programs. So you are competing with many other things. Having said that, though, I think it is incumbent upon the parents and teachers to give an opportunity for the kids to play with the knives and the crafts, and certainly potatoes and bananas. These things are easily available and can be handled, introduced as fun project. And the lighting the little LED with the potato offers a fun to the at least, if not all the kids, but some of the kids. So you never know unless you try to introduce these.
There's a very strong maker movement or maker groups in the Silicon Valley there.
Yes, indeed.
Have you taken any of the parasets or even the potato radio to a maker fair to show it off?
No, I haven't done that yet. But, I have been in touch with the Potato Growers Association in Idaho. Well, and it's not going anywhere now. Maybe that's not a right organization to work with. I think there are ways to do it. It takes parents and teachers to work up to use the imagination to do some fun project.
I think that's true. What excites you the most now? The Sunspot cycle is up. You've got obviously a beautiful set of radios and you love QRP. What excites you the most now about amateur radio?
I have been experimenting with all kinds of antennas, outdoor antennas, and because I live now in the antenna restricted area, and so my on-air activities primarily outdoors. Fortunately, I live in a very good climate in Northern California. We have more sunny days than not, and so as I mentioned, every Friday afternoon, I get together with a small group of people interested in QRPs and operate in the San Francisco Bay Public Park. And so in the past few years, I have been experimenting with all kinds of portable antennas. So I have built all manners of vertical antennas and magnetic loop antennas. And in the past few months, especially, I have been working with the full-size delta loop antenna that is attached to the back of my car.
So that means you put up a pole about 10 meters and you hang the delta loop on that?
Actually, my latest concoction, my creation is the 4-band delta loop.
Really?
Yes, it is a telescopic fiberglass. It has two elements.
You're holding it up in two places, so you got two poles.
Yes, two places, and attached to the back of my car. And I run the wire, so 3 wires. One cut for 20 meter, and that also works very well for 10 meter, and then 17 and 15. So there are 3 wires.
3 loops hanging from those 2 poles.
Yeah, and supported by the telescopic fiberglass on both sides, and then hang with the bungee cords, small bungee cords.
For the listeners, he's showing a picture, which I hope he'll send me and I can put it in the show notes. Okay, so are you using the fiberglass fishing poles for this, or did you actually buy some kind of push-up mast like from DX Engineering or something?
Pactenna, P-A-C-T-E-N-N-A, Pactenna used to produce, I don't know what they still do, but at least they used to sell the telescopic fiberglass, which is very much like the clap ear, the telescopic, the fishing pole. There's no reason why you can't use a fishing pole.
They'll go up at least 6 meters.
Right. It's very light, and I like the fact that actually it bends. That makes it gives it tension to keep the wire straight. And I am actually I'm almost finished with writing the article about this particular 4-band delta loop.
The delta loop, the radiation pattern is perpendicular to the loop itself, right? So it's going to go right off the back of your car.
Yes.
So you just point your car across the bay?
Right. And the Delta loop is I have built is the most efficient antenna, portable antenna I have built among many kinds of antennas I have built. It's big, of course, but by attaching it to the back of my car, I have a kind of nice base.
Would you say this is your favorite antenna now for portable operation?
So far, yes. And actually, I'm hoping to be able to make it. This is a sort of single element for each fan, but I want to make it 2 elements or possibly even 3 elements, using my car's body.
So you're making a Delta loop beam.
Right. That's my next project. It requires a lot of mechanical sort of trial and error.
Hiroki, before we finish, do you have advice that you'd give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
My advice would be just stay low key. You don't have to have a giant antenna. You don't have to have fancy equipment, but you can still enjoy ham radio and just stay low key and try to enjoy what it can do. I don't know whether that be appropriate advice for everybody, but that's how I have maintained my interest. As I mentioned earlier, while I was working hard, that I didn't have much time, much on the air time, but I have kept the interest throughout my life. It has been a true avocation. It has never been my vocation. I have never made money from ham radio activities, and I have spent money, but I have kept it alive since I was a kid. So,
and I think that's amazing. Hiroki, this was such an amazing opportunity for me to speak to you and to talk to you about the things that interest you in ham radio. I've really enjoyed this. I know this will be a very successful episode 500 of the QSO Today podcast. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel honored that I am the 500th interviewee on your program. Stay well, 73. This is AH6CY.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Hiroki. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AH6CY in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.